Good afternoon. Welcome to the 14th Annual ICDL Conference. I'm Nancy Greenspan. Stanley would be very pleased to see you all here, and it is wonderful that you all can participate in honoring him this weekend. See, that's a little low, but recently I was rearranging books, and I came across a book I hadn't seen in a long time, and it made me realize how important it was to Stanley as he was writing it. And as I looked through it, it made me realize how much it was a lot about his past and a lot about his future. And it's this book right here. It's called Psychopathology and Adaptation in Infancy and Early Childhood. It was written in 1981 by Stanley. I want to describe a little bit about it to you. It was #1 in a series called Infant Clinical Reports, published by the National Center for Clinical Infant Programs. That name may not resonate with you, or many of you, some of you it will, but it's now known as 0 to 3. And just as background, in 1975, Stanley gathered together a group of prominent experts in the field of child development here in Washington to discuss intellectual and emotional growth in early childhood. His goal, as he states in our new book, The Learning Tree, was to launch a new era in understanding young children. Stanley always thought big. And as importantly, he always carried out those thoughts. That meeting materialized into what is now 0 to 3, with Stanley as its first president. It also gave inspiration, to some degree, to the study described in this book. This book presented the preliminary clinical constructs of an intervention study with high-risk infants and their families, which Stanley began in 1977. He had already conceptualized the DIR model under a slightly different name at that point, which he published in a monograph in 1979. But this new book was the first to clarify, as he put it, a clinically based conceptual framework with identifiable landmarks for assessment, intervention, and evaluation. In fact, as it turned out, the intervention study gave Stanley the experience upon which to create floor time. The editorial board for the book series was composed of those whom he invited to Washington in 1975, and it's an illustrious group. Sally Provence was the editor-in-chief, Peter Bloss Jr., Selma Freiberg, Barry Brazelton, Peter Neubauer, Leon Yarrow, and Stanley was also on the board. In acknowledgments to the book, Stanley gave special credit to his mentor, Reg Laurie, a child psychiatrist who was also part of the group that became 0 to 3. And it was Reg, over the years, who had conceived many of the ideas for clinical approaches to infants and planted the seed for the study. Stanley's ideas owe more to Reg than anyone else. Reg was a very important person in the field of child psychiatry and should be a person who is not forgotten. He was extremely helpful to Stanley and to this whole field and to everybody here, consequently. Others he acknowledged in this section were Patricia Allison, who was the first overall supervisor, and Serena Weeder, who was her successor and finished the program. He recognized their contributions and the success of the program. He thanked Alicia Lieberman, who contributed to quantifying complex clinical phenomena. And then Stanley writes, perhaps most crucial to the success of this services research effort, however, have been the primary clinicians and infant specialists who work directly with the participants. In short, your predecessors. Those who saw the needs of the infants, recognized the potential of the DIR model, and were instrumental in initiating many of the principles of floor time. Therapeutic components you now recognize, but were largely unrecognized 30 years ago. This evolution in thinking that has occurred since the early 1980s reinforces the final sentence on the book flap. It reads, quote, "It is a theory which, based on Greenspan's own integration of a psychoanalytic and Piagetian concepts, seems increasingly likely to dominate our thinking about child development in the years to come." End of quote. An article in the New York Times this week on research at the Mind Institute demonstrates that point. The article quotes therapists there explaining to parents the need to exchange smiles and to focus on babbling and simple social interactions that occur in normal routine. I read this and said, sounds a little bit like engagement in circle of communications. One child profiled was more engaged with inanimate objects. The father tried to engage him in several ways. Finally, the father picked up a stuffed animal and put it on his head. How many times have we seen Stanley do things like that? In this case, the therapist explained to the father, "You put that toy on your head and he was drawn to your face. You were using the toy to enhance the social interaction. When you bring it to your face, he's with you." Stanley systematically introduced these ideas in a comprehensive structure 30 years ago. Over the course of the 1980s, Stanley and I wrote 2 books for parents, First Feelings and then The Essential Partnership. These books developed and gave a name to the concept of floor time, and fortunately for parents, greatly simplified the descriptors of the stages. Homeostasis, which is what he calls the first stage in this book, became interest in the world. Somatic psychological differentiation became developing intentional communication, and capacity for organizing internal representations became creating emotional ideas. Stanley was very hard to sell on these changes. He couldn't understand why you would use 3 words when you could use 5 or 6 multisyllabic words, as we've all seen in everything he titled. In fact, in 1990, he began a nonprofit called the Foundation for the Prevention and Treatment of Developmental Disorders in Children. He created a board of lawyers and psychiatrists in Bethesda, as well as him and me, and in our living room organized seminars to explore new intervention concepts. By 1997, he had broadened his thinking and saw the need to focus on multidisciplinary approaches. He changed the name of the nonprofit, and ICDL was born. He had a lot of help in doing that at that time. Serena came on the board, and also there were friends who are here in the audience who helped finance it, in fact, the Unicorn Foundation. ICDL's launching occurred 13 years ago with a conference similar to today's. It was an exciting event. See for yourself. Here is a clip from the first day that is quite historic.
My distinct honor and pleasure to introduce the first part of today's program. Many of you know that Professor Lovaas, and really he needs no introduction. His work has been widely acclaimed, but even more importantly, is widely used throughout the world. And also many of you know that Professor Lovaas really pioneered the notion of intensive individual work, in addition to working out techniques to implement that work, but the fact that you could work intensively with children who formerly many people believed only had limited potential. And also, Dr. Lovaas, I think, brought to the world's attention the potential of children who had severe and difficult problems. And while I hope you'll hear throughout the day that there may be different ways of working intensively with children, and there may be some different emphases that I hope by the end of the day we'll see how some of these can actually work together, and some of these actually can be combined in very useful ways. But I wanted to give my personal admiration for Dr. Lovaas's pioneering work in opening the door to what I believe will be future generations of discovering new and even more impactful ways of working intensively with infants and children with severe developmental problems. He, more than anyone else, has shown that the nervous system can grow, and that limitations, even if they're documented on PET scans, need not be permanent limitations. So with that brief introduction, let me turn over the morning to Professor Lovaas, and thank him for joining us today.
I want to thank Dr. Greenspan for inviting me to the conference and to the members of the Interdisciplinary Council.
I want to thank Professor Lovas for can we put this on? Yeah. I want to thank Professor Lovas for a wonderful, wonderful presentation, not only keeping us laughing, but also helping us become very knowledgeable about both his earlier work and his current work, especially some of the more exciting replication studies. So we're all eagerly looking forward to finding out more about that. Can you all hear okay? Yeah. In a moment, we're going to take our lunch break, but before that, I just wanted to create a transition for this afternoon's presentation. And I wanted to underline Dr. Lovas' ability to get us laughing and his ability to get that little girl laughing that you saw on the tape. And you saw her whole face brighten and relaxed, and you saw the engagement and the warmth as she began responding to him as a person and wanting to interact with him, and I'm sure also please him, not just for the water, but because of not just the kissing, but because of the laughter and his ability to create that affective tone between the two of them. And the reason why I'm highlighting this, I'm going to try to persuade Dr. Lovas this afternoon. I'm going to try to persuade Dr. Lovas this afternoon there's more to a hug than a hug.
When Dr. Lovas's son saw this, he sent a very nice note to everyone in ICDL, which was very much appreciated. Last year at this time, Stanley's health was declining very quickly. He sensed that he might not live much longer. So when he spoke here, he took the opportunity to describe how he developed the DIR model. And that is also on the YouTube channel, and you can see that for yourself. It's a clip. He wanted to set down his path for the record and in his own words. Since revisionist history sometimes creeps in, especially after someone dies, he wanted clinicians and educators to understand the theoretical antecedents and his intellectual journey. Stanley's ideas are rich, complex, and subtle. Sometimes people can miss the essence. Consequently, he began to see drift. That is, core concepts that were too simplified or glossed over or changed, but not in a way, as he saw it, that improved the model. Even so, Stanley's model is so robust that when not implemented exactly correctly, or the way he would do it, which would be very difficult to do anyway, children still make marked improvement. Last January, he said to me very deliberately that he was going to get better. He wanted to expand on what he had done. He kept saying that there was so much more to do to help children, but he just couldn't do it. And now it's up to you. You are the successors to those primary clinicians who worked with the infants and young children 30 years ago. When in doubt about the model and the principles, go back and read Stanley's books. It's all there. I may be a little biased, but I don't really think so. But after watching from up close and personal for over 35 years, I can honestly say that Stanley was the most brilliant theoretician, diagnostician, and clinician there ever was. His theories, although an integration of those clinicians he greatly admired, are singularly his. And they have created over these 30 years an awakening to the potential of all infants and young children. That there are tiny emotional and cognitive worlds inside each one, just waiting to burst forth if given the right emotional environment. I wish you all Godspeed. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Cecilia Breinbauer. She is the managing director of ICDL. She is also a child psychiatrist and has a master's degree in public health. She's worked for ICDL for several years, but has always stayed in the background. But together, she and Stanley created the ICDL Graduate School. He found her help to be invaluable. Fortunately for ICDL, she's now organizing the implementation of the strategic plan, and she had a major role, along with Ricky and Serena, in conceiving and organizing this conference. And I want to thank her also for finding and choosing all the video clips that you will see in the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nancy, for being with us today.